Imagine you are in the year 2072, scrolling through old documentaries about the AI age, and you realize something strange. Almost nobody back then talked about the real war that was being fought. People argued about borders, ideology, trade, and energy. But the quiet, decisive struggle of the 21st century was not about land or oil. It was about compute. Compute became the new strategic asset. Whoever controlled the most GPU clusters, the biggest data centers, the energy to feed them, and the models running on top could shape the future. And at the center of that struggle stood two powers, the United States, with NVIDIA as the crown jewel of its compute stack, and China, building its own path to independence. To see how those two blocks emerged, you have to go back to roughly the years between 2025 and 2035. In that window, countries started to realize that AI was not just another technology. It was a strategic layer. AI models began to influence economies, healthcare systems, defense, education, and public decision-making. Nations with access to the best models could optimize logistics, accelerate biotech, harden cyber defense, and even forecast economic cycles more accurately. That shifted the question from who has money to who has compute. NVIDIA, in that phase, supplied the hardware and software that made all of this possible. GPU hardware, networking gear, drivers, frameworks, and, most importantly, the CUDA ecosystem that locked in developers and institutions. China watched this unfold with very clear eyes. In the decade of the 2020s, it had already invested heavily in AI applications, but it did not have reliable access to all Western semiconductors. The United States started to introduce export controls on advanced chips and lithography tools. On paper, these measures were about national security. In reality, everyone understood they were about strategic leverage. The message to China was simple: your compute future depends on our goodwill. For a country with more than 1.4 billion citizens and huge ambitions in biotech, defense, and digital infrastructure, that was unacceptable. That is what triggered what historians now call the compute spur. China's massive coordinated push to build its own GPU architectures, software frameworks, and data centers began in earnest. At first, those systems lagged behind NVIDIA's products. They were slower, less efficient, and lacked mature tooling. But from the vantage point of 2072, it is obvious that this did not matter. China had three advantages that are hard to compete with: time, scale, and political will. It did not need a free market to vote on whether the project made sense. It simply decided to do it. Meanwhile, something else was happening in the United States. While Europe wrestled with regulation and energy constraints, American policymakers started to treat compute as a core part of national power. From roughly the year 2030 onward, NVIDIA was no longer viewed as just a tech company. It was treated as a strategic asset. Washington rolled out rules similar to defense export controls for advanced GPUs, supported hyperscalers in building domestic data centers, and sponsored energy projects designed specifically to power large AI clusters. Insiders understood the logic. Compute equals capability. AI models were not just generating fun images and writing emails. They were simulating physical systems, optimizing supply chains, scanning networks for cyber attacks, guiding autonomous platforms, and crunching intelligence data. The race for AI was, in practice, a race for strategic leverage. NVIDIA's data center, GPUs, were the engines inside that machine for the American bloc. The tension between these two worlds was amplified by a factor many people still underestimated at the time: data. Data is the fuel of AI. China, with its enormous population, centralized digital governance, and wide-reaching surveillance apparatus, had access to vast streams of information. The United States had the strongest compute and many of the most advanced models. That created two distinct paths to AI power: a data-heavy path and a compute-heavy path. Western countries tried to scale data through private companies and open markets. China tried to scale compute through state programs and national champions. By the late years of the decade, starting around 2030, these two approaches began to clash more openly. The United States kept extending export bans to cover each new GPU generation. NVIDIA was barred from selling its most powerful data center chips to Chinese entities. China responded by heavily subsidizing its domestic GPU vendors and pressuring or acquiring European toolmakers in the chip supply chain. It launched state projects to build 3 nanometer, 2 nanometer, and even 1.4 nanometer nodes, on a scale that reminded older observers of the Manhattan Project or the Apollo program. The war was not kinetic, it was industrial. Looking from 2072, you can break this conflict into 3 phases. In the first phase, between roughly 2025 and 2035, China tried to buy what it needed. It imported chips, licenses, tools, and talent wherever it could. This was the integration phase. In the second phase, from around 2035 to 2045, export controls forced China to innovate at home. It stopped relying on imports and began to build. Domestic GPU architectures emerged, homegrown data centers expanded rapidly, and national AI ecosystems took shape. In the third phase, from about 2045 to 2060, China stopped trying to chase NVIDIA altogether. It created its own standards, its own software stacks, and in many areas no longer depended on Western technology at all. Throughout those phases, NVIDIA was not just watching from the sidelines. The company faced a world where a huge chunk of the potential market was sealed off behind geopolitical walls. NVIDIA could not sell to China. China could not buy from NVIDIA. In a normal commercial story, that would mean devastating losses for the firm with the best product. But something different played out. While China built its own accelerators, NVIDIA dug deeper into the Western ecosystem. It evolved from a chip company into a full compute stack provider, hardware, software, networking, security, and pre-optimized models on top. Companies, universities, hospitals, research labs, and governments all leaned on NVIDIA-certified systems. It became infrastructure. In the same way power grids and telecom networks had once become infrastructure. By the time this new equilibrium emerged, both blocs had reached a similar destination by very different roads: compute sovereignty. China did not want to depend on NVIDIA. The United States did not want China to access NVIDIA. The result was a split world. Where the early internet age imagined one global network, the compute age ended up with 2 parallel stacks, the NVIDIA stack in the West and the Sino stack in the East. The consequences of that split were massive. Global companies could no longer simply deploy everywhere. Models trained in the West could not easily run in China because they relied on NVIDIA's software and tooling. Models built in China could not be trained at scale on Western clusters because they were designed for different hardware and different frameworks. Even standards began to diverge. Data formats, model architectures, privacy regimes, and safety rules drifted apart. People in the 1940s and 1950s sometimes talked about a splinternet. In hindsight, it was not really the internet that split, it was compute. The split was not purely negative. In a strange way, it created redundancy. If the entire planet had depended on NVIDIA, any major conflict or sanction regime could have crippled everyone at once. If the entire planet had depended on Chinese AI infrastructure, political power would have been dangerously concentrated. 2 robust ecosystems created redundancy, diversity, and strategic autonomy. It was similar to how, in the 20th century, the world built multiple energy sources and supply routes to avoid being hostage to one producer. In the compute age, GPU capacity became the new barrel of oil, and NVIDIA was one of the major producers rather than the only one. Today, in the year 2072, the geopolitics of compute looks mature. Policymakers talk about infrastructure in a way that would have sounded strange a century earlier. Roads, ports, and airports are still important. But so are GPU clusters, data centers, energy reserves, network capacity, and AI ecosystems. NVIDIA played a historic role in that shift, not because it defeated China or dominated the entire globe, but because it formed the technological backbone of one half of the world's compute power. The real story of NVIDIA and China was never a story of 2 companies fighting in a vacuum. It was a story of two strategies. The American strategy, with NVIDIA at its core, focused on pushing the frontier of compute innovation. The Chinese strategy focused on guaranteeing compute sovereignty, no matter what. In their own ways, both strategies won. The West won the innovation race. China won the independence race. The lesson from that whole period is simple and uncomfortable. Technology is not neutral. Whoever builds the tools shapes the world that runs on them. NVIDIA helped build the West. China built its own stack for the East. The planet did not become better or worse in one absolute sense. It became more complex. Instead of a single global architecture, we ended up with two parallel futures, running side by side on different silicon.